They laughed when a retired SWAT officer bought a $1 cabin at the edge of a frozen mountain town. To them, it was a mistake. To him, it was a place to disappear. But on the second night, his German shepherd stopped sleeping, stopped moving, and stared at the floor like something was breathing beneath it. What the dog uncovered would drag a buried truth into the light and force a man who wanted silence to face everything he ran from. Stay with this story, because what's hidden below that cabin was never meant to be found. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. Winter arrived early in the mountain town, burying the roads under pale snow and pressing silence into every corner of the valley. Frank Miller arrived just before dusk, his pickup crawling up the narrow, iced road as gray clouds sank low over the pines. At 63, he moved with the careful restraint of a man who had learned what sudden movements could cost. His shoulders were broad but slightly sloped now, the weight of years and memory bending them forward. A thick gray beard framed a face carved with hard lines and old scars, one thin white mark cutting through his left eyebrow, another faint indentation along his jaw where bone had once cracked and healed wrong. His hair, once dark, was now steel-colored and kept short, more from habit than style. Frank's eyes were the most telling thing about him, a washed-out blue that had seen too much violence to be curious anymore. He did not come to Pine Hollow looking for peace. He came looking for absence. The house waited at the end of the road like something forgotten, a one-story wooden structure leaning slightly to the right, its porch sagging under the weight of old snow. The roof dipped in the middle, shingles curled and cracked like dried bark. One small window stared blindly toward the forest. The place had been listed by the county for $1, abandoned for years after taxes went unpaid and no heirs came forward. Frank hadn't questioned why no one wanted it. He understood unwanted things. When he shut off the engine, the silence pressed in hard. No traffic, no voices, just wind threading through trees and the soft ticking of cooling metal. Frank sat there longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, breath fogging the cab. Cities had noise even when they slept. Out here, silence had weight. The passenger door opened before he moved. Rex stepped down slowly, joints stiff but controlled. The German shepherd was nearly 10 years old, his once jet-black muzzle now dusted with gray. He stood tall and solid, built like a working dog even in age, chest broad, legs thick with muscle, earned through years of training and deployment. One ear tipped slightly forward, the other bore a small notch from an old shrapnel injury that never quite healed. His amber eyes scanned the surroundings with quiet intensity, never frantic, never relaxed. Rex had learned long ago that stillness was a form of readiness. Frank watched him for a moment, the corner of his mouth tightening in what might have been a smile if he allowed himself those anymore. Rex had been his partner for 7 years on the SWAT team, not a pet, not family. Something closer to a mirror, loyal, disciplined, damaged in similar ways. "You're home," Frank muttered, though he wasn't sure which of them he meant. The porch boards groaned under his weight as he climbed the steps. One plank dipped alarmingly, and Frank adjusted instinctively, redistributing his balance like he used to during breaching drills. Rex followed close, nails clicking softly, positioning himself just behind Frank's left leg, the side Frank favored when things went bad. The door stuck before opening with a dry scrape. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and cold dust. A single room, no furniture, bare walls stained by time. The floorboards were uneven, warped by years of neglect. A frayed light cord hung from the ceiling, ending in a naked bulb that flickered weakly when Frank twisted the switch. It wasn't much. That was the point. Frank set his duffel down near the wall and leaned his forehead briefly against the door, eyes closed. Images pressed at the edges of his mind like they always did when things grew quiet. Flashbangs, shouted commands, the weight of a dying man collapsing into his arms during a raid that had gone wrong 12 years ago. That night had changed everything. The investigation that followed, the quiet reassignment, the forced retirement wrapped in polite words and paperwork. Betrayal didn't always come loud. Sometimes it came in silence. Rex circled the room slowly, nose close to the floor, reading the house like a map. He paused near one corner, head lifting slightly. His tail stiffened. Frank noticed but said nothing. Dogs noticed things humans dismissed. He trusted that. A knock on the open doorframe made both of them freeze. Frank turned slowly. A woman stood on the porch, boots dusted with snow, arms folded tightly against the cold. She was in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with a lean frame shaped by years of physical work rather than exercise. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a low braid streaked with silver, resting against the collar of her thick wool coat. Her skin was pale from winter, her face angular but not unkind, with sharp cheekbones and tired green eyes that measured before they softened. She didn't smile, but she didn't scowl either. "Didn't mean to startle you," she said, voice low and steady. "Name's Sarah Collins. I live down the road." Frank studied her briefly, habit overriding courtesy. No sudden movements, no concealed hostility, hands visible. He nodded once. "Frank," he replied, no last name. He rarely used it anymore. Her gaze flicked briefly to Rex, lingering on the dog's scars and posture. Recognition passed through her expression, not fear, respect. "He's trained," she said quietly. "Yes," Frank answered. Sarah shifted her weight, boots crunching softly. "Folks don't get many newcomers this time of year, especially not to this place." "I won't be trouble," Frank said. The words came automatically. She met his eyes then, studying the lines around them. "Town's small," she replied. "People talk. Doesn't mean they know anything." Rex stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between them, not aggressively, just enough. Sarah noticed and took half a step back, raising one hand. "It's all right," she murmured, more to Rex than Frank. "I just came to see if you needed anything. Power's unreliable. Roads get worse after dark." Frank hesitated, then shook his head. "We're fine," Sarah nodded, accepting the dismissal without offense. "If that changes, my place has a blue gate, Collins Farm. You'll see it." She turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth," she added, glancing back, "that house doesn't like loud men, or careless ones." Frank watched her walk away, the braid swaying gently against her coat. An odd comment, but towns had their own superstitions. He shut the door. That night, the wind howled harder. Snow tapped against the window like fingertips. Frank sat on the floor with his back against the wall, boots still on, Rex curled beside him, warm and solid. Sleep came in fragments, dreams clawed. He woke twice to the sound of something settling beneath the house, a hollow metallic echo that made his chest tighten. Rex was awake both times, ears pricked, gaze fixed on the same corner of the room. "Tomorrow," Frank whispered at last, resting a hand on the dog's thick neck. "We'll see what tomorrow looks like." Rex did not relax. Outside, Pine Hollow slept. The cheap house did not. The cold deepened after the first night, settling into the bones of the house as if it had been waiting for Frank Miller to arrive. Morning came late, light filtered weakly through low clouds, and the air inside the cabin felt heavier than the temperature alone could explain. Frank woke stiff and sore, boots still on, his back protesting the hard floor. Rex had not slept. The dog stood near the same corner he'd watched all night, body angled slightly forward, muscles tense but controlled, amber eyes fixed on the warped boards as if they might move on their own. Frank followed the dog's gaze. The floor there looked no different than anywhere else. Old pine planks, darkened by moisture, swollen and uneven with age. Still, something about it felt wrong. Years on SWAT had trained him to respect instincts, especially the ones that came without explanation. "You smell something?" Frank asked quietly. Rex didn't look at him. His ears flicked once. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not a growl meant to threaten, but a warning, restrained and deliberate. Frank rubbed his face slowly, fingers dragging through his beard. He'd told himself this move north was about simplicity, about silence. But silence, he knew too well, could hide things. The second night brought confirmation. Wind battered the house after sunset, forcing snow through gaps in the siding. Frank sat at the small folding table he'd brought with him, sorting through tools when he heard it again, a faint metallic sound beneath the floor. Not wood settling, not pipes. This was sharper, hollow, brief, like metal brushing metal. Rex reacted instantly, stepping to the corner, placing one heavy paw against the board as if marking it. His tail stiffened straight out, a sign Frank remembered from building searches the moment before Rex would signal a find. Frank crouched, placing his palm flat against the floor. The wood was colder there. Not damp cold like the rest of the cabin, but deeper, unnatural, as if something below held its own temperature. He tapped lightly with his knuckle. The sound rang differently, thin and echoing. That did it. Frank stood and fetched a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the floor, then the walls, then back again. The house felt smaller with each step. Rex watched him closely now, eyes alert, tracking every movement. Frank pried gently at the board with a screwdriver. It resisted at first, then shifted slightly. No nails protesting, no splintering crack. Just a soft scrape, almost intentional. He froze. "No," Frank muttered under his breath. "That's not right." He worked the board free, inch by inch, until it lifted cleanly, revealing not dirt or foundation stone, but a dull metal plate beneath, smooth, cold, marked faintly with a serial number barely visible under decades of grime. Frank stared, breath slow and controlled, heart thudding with a rhythm he recognized all too well. This wasn't amateur. This wasn't accidental. Rex leaned, in close, nostrils flaring, then sat back on his haunches, eyes locked on the opening as if standing guard. Frank reached down and brushed his fingers along the edge of the plate. The metal was thick, reinforced. He knocked once, hollow again. Beneath it lay space, purpose-built space. Someone had hidden something here. Frank lowered himself to the floor, pressing his ear close. Silence answered, but it wasn't empty. It felt watched, waiting. He pulled the plate free with effort, muscles straining. The opening beneath yawned dark and narrow, cold air breathing up into the room like a held breath released. A ladder descended into darkness. Frank sat back hard, pulse climbing. "This isn't a house," he whispered. "It's a lid." Rex barked once, sharp and low, then went still again. Footsteps crunched outside. Frank moved instantly, sliding the board back into place, dusting the edges with his sleeve until the seam vanished into the floor. He stood just as a knock sounded at the door, not loud, respectful. He opened it to find Sarah Collins standing on the porch again, bundled against the cold, a knit cap pulled low over her braided hair. Up close, Frank noticed more details. Sarah was taller than average for a woman, maybe 5'8", built lean and solid, like someone used to lifting feed sacks or handling livestock. Her skin was weathered from years outdoors, pale but tough, with faint lines etched deep at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, carrying the weight of someone who had learned to measure words carefully. There was something guarded about her posture, as if trust was something she rationed. "I saw your truck lights earlier," she said. "Figured you were still alive." Frank nodded once. "For now." Her gaze flicked past him into the house, landing briefly on Rex, who stood at Frank's side, posture calm but watchful. Sarah exhaled slowly. "He's on edge." "He's earned it," Frank replied. She hesitated, then spoke lower. "You hear anything strange last night?" Frank studied her. The question wasn't casual. It carried weight. "Why?" he asked. Sarah's jaw tightened. "Because that house has a history, and because I heard metal?" Silence stretched between them. Rex's ears pricked. Sarah continued, "Years back, before my time, there were rumors, men passing through town who didn't stay, equipment coming in late at night. The old sheriff shut questions down fast, then the place went quiet. Folks decided it was easier not to ask." Frank held her gaze. He didn't tell her what he'd found. Not yet. "You should stay clear of it," he said. Sarah gave a thin smile. "I already live next to it." She turned to leave, then paused. "Whatever's under that floor," she said quietly. "It woke up the moment you moved in." After she left, Frank locked the door and leaned against it, breath slow, measured. Rex pressed close, grounding him. Frank knelt and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's neck. "We don't dig tonight," he murmured. "We watch." They did. Long hours passed, punctuated only by wind and the soft creak of old wood. Nothing emerged, nothing moved, but neither of them slept. When dawn finally came, thin and gray, Frank knew one thing for certain. He hadn't come to Pine Hollow to disappear. The house wouldn't let him. Frank waited 2 full days before opening the hatch again. Snow fell steadily during that time, softening the edges of Pine Hollow and muting the world until even footsteps felt distant. He spent those days repairing the porch, reinforcing the doorframe, and watching. The watching mattered most. At 63, he trusted patience more than strength. Rex stayed close, shadowing him with the quiet diligence of a dog who sensed a shift in the ground beneath their lives. On the third night, when the town lights dimmed and the wind settled, Frank slid the hidden board aside and descended. The ladder creaked softly as he climbed down, boots finding metal rungs worn smooth by long use. The air changed immediately, colder, drier, carrying a faint electrical tang that prickled memory. His flashlight cut through the dark, revealing a chamber larger than the cabin above, reinforced with steel panels riveted into place. This wasn't a cellar. It was engineered, purposeful. Rex followed, landing lightly at Frank's side, muscles taut, ears forward. The dog's movements were slower these days, joints stiff from age, but his focus was unchanged. He scanned corners, seams, shadows, the way he had in corridors overseas. Frank felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He hadn't been down a ladder like this since his last operation, the one that ended everything. Shelving lined the far wall, each unit bolted down. On them sat equipment preserved under layers of dust, radios with cracked casings, sealed metal cases stamped with faded agency markings, binders wrapped in oilcloth. Frank's breath fogged as he reached for the nearest binder. Inside were typed reports, dates spanning nearly 30 years, names he recognized too well. Commanders, city officials, a few retired, a few still active if memory served. The word oversight appeared often, so did containment. Frank swallowed. This wasn't small-town corruption. This was a pipeline. He moved methodically, cataloging with his eyes, resisting the urge to rush. That discipline had kept him alive more than once. He found a handheld recorder, outdated but intact, with a strip of masking tape labeled in block letters, "Final Entry." He didn't press play. Not yet. He wasn't ready to hear a voice from the past explain what his gut already knew. Above them, the cabin creaked. Rex froze. His head snapped toward the ladder, then toward the ceiling. A low growl vibrated through him, quiet, contained. Frank killed the flashlight and listened. Footsteps. Careful. The porch boards complained under weight that knew where to step. Someone was at the door. Frank gestured once. Rex shifted behind him, positioning his body between Frank and the ladder. Frank climbed fast, heart hammering now, adrenaline cutting through the cold. He eased the hatch closed from below, sliding the board back into place until the seam vanished. By the time he stood in the cabin, the doorknob was turning. The lock held. The doorframe groaned. Whoever was outside tested it once more, harder this time, then stopped. Silence followed. Thick, deliberate. Frank felt the old instinct flare, the one that measured angles and exits and counted breaths. Rex moved forward a half step, teeth bared, not barking, not yet. The door exploded inward. The intruder moved with trained efficiency. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark winter gear, layered for silence rather than warmth. A mask covered the lower half of his face, but Frank caught the flash of pale skin and the hard set of a jaw. The man's eyes were sharp, gray, scanning, calculating. He didn't hesitate when Rex launched. The kick came fast, too fast. Rex took it to the ribs, the impact echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. He yelped and went down hard, skidding across the floor. Frank roared and charged, shoulders slamming into the intruder's chest. The man staggered, recovered, and disengaged with practiced speed, retreating through the shattered doorway and vanishing into the snow-laced dark. Frank dropped to his knees beside Rex, hands shaking as he checked the dog's side. The shepherd's breathing was ragged, eyes glassy with pain. No blood. But the damage was real. "I've got you," Frank whispered, voice breaking despite himself. He pressed his forehead to Rex's neck, feeling the dog's heartbeat flutter and then steady under his palm. Years fell away in that moment, years of telling himself he didn't need anyone, that isolation was safer. He lifted Rex carefully and laid him near the heater, wrapping him in the spare blanket Sarah had left 2 days earlier without a word. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called it in. Or maybe the intruder had wanted that too. By morning, the town knew something had happened. Trucks idled along the road. Curtains twitched. Frank ignored them all. He focused on Rex, bandaging, coaxing water, whispering the kind of promises men make when they're terrified to lose the last thing that anchors them. Sarah arrived just after dawn. She stood in the doorway, breath clouding, eyes widening when she saw the damage. Up close, Frank noticed the way she carried herself, upright, shoulders squared, movements economical. She had the build of someone who had learned to stand ground. Her hair, freed from its braid, fell to her shoulders in dark waves streaked with silver. Her hands trembled only once. "Who did this?" she asked. Frank met her gaze. "Someone who doesn't want what's under this house seen." She nodded slowly. "Then it's real." They moved Rex together to her truck, a weathered blue pickup with a cracked windshield and a back seat lined with old quilts. Sarah drove carefully to the nearest vet 2 towns over. The veterinarian, Dr. Helen Moore, was a woman in her early 60s with cropped gray hair and a calm, no-nonsense manner shaped by decades of emergency calls. She examined Rex with practiced hands, confirming bruised ribs and a cracked cartilage plate, painful but survivable. "He's tough," Dr. Moore said quietly, "but he needs rest, and you need to be careful." Back at the cabin, Frank sat alone amid broken wood and cold ash. He stared at the hatch beneath the floor, the evidence stacked neatly below, the recorder waiting. The past had followed him here, kicked down his door, hurt his dog. Frank exhaled slowly, the decision settling into place like a weight he accepted rather than fought. "No more silence," he murmured. Above the floor, Pine Hollow watched. Below it, the truth waited. Winter did not loosen its grip on Pine Hollow. If anything, it pressed harder, snow piling high against fences and roofs, the cold settling into the ground like a verdict. Frank Miller felt it in his bones each morning when he rose from the chair beside Rex's bed, joints aching, breath shallow for a moment before discipline took over. At 63, pain was no longer a warning. It was a companion. Rex lay on a thick blanket near the heater, his large frame still, chest rising carefully. The German shepherd's once effortless strength had given way to stiffness and guarded movement. His amber eyes, however, had lost none of their sharpness. He tracked Frank across the room, tail giving a single slow thump whenever Frank looked back. The cracked cartilage in his ribs would heal, the veterinarian had said, but time would be the deciding factor. Time and rest. 2 things neither man nor dog had ever been good at. Frank crouched beside him, fingers working gently through the dense fur along Rex's neck. "You stay," he murmured. "I'll handle the rest." Rex didn't move, but his gaze hardened, as if he understood the lie. Frank stood and pulled on his coat. The decision he'd made after the break-in hadn't faded with the morning light. It had sharpened. Silence had protected him for years, but it had never healed him. And it had almost cost Rex his life. Sarah Collins was already outside when Frank stepped onto the porch. She stood near the blue pickup, shoulders squared against the wind, hands tucked into worn leather gloves. In daylight, she looked stronger than she had the first night they met, tall, lean, built by years of hauling feed and fixing fences. Her dark hair was braided again, threaded with silver that caught the pale sun. Her skin was pale but weathered, the kind that had seen too many winters to be delicate. When she turned, her green eyes searched Frank's face with open concern. "How is he?" she asked. "Hurts," Frank replied, still watching the door. Sarah nodded, lips tightening briefly. "Sounds about right." She followed him inside, pausing to let Rex sniff her gloved hand. He did, then settled again, trusting but alert. Sarah straightened slowly. "You going to tell someone about what you found?" "I already did," Frank said. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Who?" Frank reached into his coat and pulled out a folded card. "Investigative reporter, Chicago-based. Name's Daniel Wright." Sarah took the card, reading it once before handing it back. "That's a long way from here. Far enough that no one local can lean on him." Daniel Wright arrived 2 days later, driving a rental SUV that looked out of place among the mud-splattered trucks lining Pine Hollow's main road. He was in his early 40s, lean to the point of sharpness, with dark hair worn too long and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow that softened otherwise angular features. His eyes were restless, observant, always moving, the eyes of a man who had learned to read rooms quickly. Years ago, a whistleblower case had nearly ended his career after a source disappeared under suspicious circumstances. It had made Daniel cautious, but it hadn't made him quiet. He listened while Frank laid out the evidence in the underground chamber, his expression tightening with each binder opened, each device uncovered. He asked precise questions, never interrupting, fingers occasionally brushing the scar along his jaw as he processed. "This isn't just a story," Daniel said finally. "This is federal." "That's why you're here," Frank replied. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I'll need copies, and I'll need time." "You won't have much," Frank said. "They already kicked my door in." Daniel looked up sharply. "Then we don't sit on this." Within a week, unmarked vehicles began appearing on the outskirts of town. Men and women in plain coats moved quietly, speaking little. Federal agents, though no one said the words out loud, Pine Hollow noticed everything. At first, suspicion sharpened like a blade. Then, questions replaced it. Frank felt the shift when Mrs. Halverson from 3 houses down brought over a pot of stew without saying a word. When the man at the hardware store rang up supplies without commentary and added an extra box of nails, just in case. When a pair of old veterans, faces lined and eyes tired, nodded once at Frank in passing, recognition flickering between them like a shared language. Sarah watched it happen from her porch, arms folded, expression thoughtful. "Told you," she said one evening as she helped Frank reinforce the door frame. "People talk. Sometimes they listen too." Rex's recovery was slow but steady. He learned to rise without wincing, learned to lie on his uninjured side, learned patience he'd never needed before. Each night, he positioned himself between Frank and the door, even when Frank slept in the chair. The presence was constant, grounding. Frank realized one night, staring into the low fire, that he hadn't slept this deeply in years. The federal team confirmed what Frank already knew. The evidence beneath the house connected to a long-running corruption network that extended far beyond Pine Hollow. Files were cataloged, devices logged, names whispered carefully. No arrests yet, not publicly. But the ground was shifting. Daniel returned one last time before leaving town, face drawn but eyes alive. "Once this breaks," he said quietly, "there's no going back." Frank nodded. "I'm not looking to." Snow fell again that night, heavy and relentless. Frank sat beside Rex, hand resting on the dog's broad shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Outside, the town lights glowed softer than before, less accusatory, more watchful. For the first time since retiring, Frank didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like one standing in it. Spring did not arrive in Pine Hollow all at once. It came cautiously, as if the land itself needed proof that it was safe to soften again. Snow still clung to the shaded edges of the forest, but the air lost its sharp bite, and water began to drip steadily from the eaves of the old house Frank Miller had once believed would swallow him whole. Frank noticed the change in his body before he noticed it in the weather. He woke without the familiar knot in his chest. His breath came easier. At 63, his movements were still deliberate, still measured, but the constant tension had loosened its grip. He sat on the porch most mornings now, wrapped in a worn jacket, watching fog lift slowly from the valley below. Rex lay beside him, stretched out fully for the first time in weeks. The German shepherd's ribs were still tender, his gait still careful, but strength had returned to his posture. His coat shone again, black and tan catching the pale sunlight, gray frosting his muzzle like a badge of earned years. His ears no longer stayed rigid through the night. Instead, they flicked lazily at birdsong, a small but profound victory. The arrests came quietly. Unmarked vehicles arrived before dawn one morning, tires crunching softly over gravel. Men and women stepped out wearing neutral coats, their movements efficient, faces set with professional calm. Frank recognized the posture immediately. Federal agents accustomed to doing their work without spectacle. Names were spoken behind closed doors, warrants executed beyond Pine Hollow, in cities Frank had once patrolled in another life. By nightfall, the news had broken nationally. The corruption network beneath the house was real, deep, systemic. Careers ended overnight, others ended in handcuffs. Frank watched the broadcast from his kitchen, Rex at his feet, tail thumping once when Frank rested a hand on his head. His name appeared briefly on the screen, followed by words he had not expected to hear in this lifetime: cleared of wrongdoing. The internal review that had shadowed his final years on the SWAT team was reopened, then formally closed. Publicly, completely. Frank turned the television off before the segment finished. Vindication was quieter than he'd imagined. It didn't roar. It settled. Sarah Collins arrived later that day, boots muddy, braid loose over one shoulder. In the softer light of early spring, she looked less guarded than she had months ago. The lines in her face remained, etched by work and winter, but there was warmth there now. She leaned against the porch rail, arms folded loosely, posture relaxed. "Well," she said, a faint smile touching her lips, "looks like the town owes you an apology." Frank snorted softly. "I'm not collecting." She glanced down at Rex, who lifted his head and wagged his tail once, slow and steady. "He looks good." "He earned it," Frank replied. Sarah hesitated, then said, "You know people are talking." "That's never stopped," Frank said. "This is different." She gestured toward the road. "They're asking what you plan to do with the place." Frank followed her gaze to the old house. It still leaned. The boards were still weathered, but the doorframe stood solid now, the porch reinforced, the windows sealed. It no longer looked abandoned. It looked lived in. "I was thinking," Frank said slowly, "it doesn't have to be just mine." The idea grew in the days that followed, not as a grand announcement, but as a quiet invitation. One man came first. Tom Gallagher, a former state trooper in his late 60s, with a stooped posture and hands that shook slightly from nerve damage sustained in a roadside bombing years earlier. His hair was thin and white, his voice soft but steady. He stayed one night, then two. Others followed: a retired corrections officer with insomnia, a former federal marshal who drank too much and spoke too little. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need explanations. The house didn't offer therapy or speeches. It offered silence, warmth, and the unspoken understanding of men and women who had seen too much and survived anyway. Rex became the constant presence among them all. He moved slowly now, choosing where to lie with care, but his watchfulness never faded. Visitors learned quickly that he accepted kindness without hesitation and dishonesty not at all. More than one hardened veteran found themselves sitting on the floor beside him, hand resting on his broad back, breathing easier without knowing why. Daniel Wright returned once, thinner than before, dark circles beneath his eyes, but satisfaction evident in the way he carried himself. "This story's going to ripple," he told Frank. "You changed things." Frank shook his head. "I didn't do it alone." Daniel's gaze followed Rex across the room. "No," he agreed. As the last snow finally melted, Pine Hollow changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the avoidance faded. Neighbors waved. Tools appeared on the porch without notes attached. One evening, someone left a wooden sign leaning against the steps. The lettering was rough but deliberate. Haven House. Frank stared at it for a long time before lifting it into place. The final night of winter arrived without ceremony. Snow fell lightly, barely clinging to the ground. Frank sat on the porch wrapped in his jacket, breath misting faintly in the air. Rex lay pressed against his leg, warmth solid and familiar. The house behind them glowed softly from within, no longer hiding secrets, no longer threatening collapse. Frank closed his eyes and listened. To the quiet, to the wind through the trees, to Rex's steady breathing. For the first time in years, nothing in the sound pulled him backward. He rested his hand on Rex's head and smiled just slightly. "I think," he said quietly, "this is home." Rex thumped his tail. Winter, at last, let go. Sometimes the miracle doesn't come as thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a second chance, a loyal companion who refuses to leave your side, or a door that opens only after you've lost everything else. God doesn't always remove the winter from our lives, but He gives us the strength to stand through it and the people or souls we need to survive it. If you're walking through a cold season right now, don't give up. What feels like the end may be the beginning of something you were meant to protect. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs. leave a comment with where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps, and thank you so much for being here.